Chapter 2. An Unpleasant Neighbor. For a moment, Nancy thought Mr. Ritter would collapse. He was so upset. "Mrs. Dondo," she asked, "do you have any proof that the letter was in this particular delivery?" "You keep out of this," the woman said, glaring at the young girl. "I'll handle the matter in my own way." "I doubt that you could make any claim," Nancy went on, despite the rebuff. "I'll get proof and I'll see that I get paid," Mrs. Dondo screamed. "I'll carry this story to the postmaster." Hannah Gruen stepped forward. "But right now you'll get out of this house," she said firmly. With an angry shrug, the unpleasant woman turned and left. Nancy asked Mr. Ritter where she lived. "Down near the corner," he replied. Nancy offered to search further for Mrs. Dondo's letter or any others she might have missed. From the time Nancy had discovered the secret of the old clock, up to the young detective's latest adventure, the witch tree symbol, she had been helping people, often exposing herself to grave danger. "My little terrier, Togo, is good at finding things," Nancy told the letter carrier. "I'll get him to help me." She urged Mr. Ritter not to be too concerned about Mrs. Dondo's accusation. They both knew it was illegal to send cash through the mail. The letter carrier said he was still worried. Even though the woman could not collect the money from him or the postal authorities, a complaint to the postmaster for carelessness would be a black mark on his record. "And I'm near retirement age," he added. "I'd like to leave this job with a clean slate." "You will," Nancy said, smiling at him affectionately. After Mr. Ritter had gone, the young sleuth hurried to the kitchen, where Togo was taking a nap. "Before I go shopping, pal," she said, "we have a job to do. Come with me." The little dog jumped up, cocked his head, and followed his mistress into the front hall. She was showing him a white envelope when the telephone rang. The caller was Bess Marvin, one of Nancy's two best friends. "What's new?" Bess asked. "A couple of mysteries. Why don't you and George come over and I'll tell you all about them?" "Sounds like fun. We'll be right there." George Fane and Bess Marvin were cousins. George, in keeping with her boyish name, wore her dark hair short and preferred sporty clothes. Bess, in contrast, was very feminine and chose to dress along those lines. She was blonde and slightly overweight because of her fondness for rich food. Nancy went outside to wait for the girls, who arrived in exactly 10 minutes. "Hypers, Nancy," said George. "You hardly give us time to recover from one mystery before you have another to solve. What's going on now?" Nancy laughed. Then, sobering, she quickly explained the need for a further hunt for Mrs. Dondo's letter. When she finished, Bess said, "I've heard Mother speak of Mrs. Dondo. She says the woman is a troublemaker." George warned, "You'd better be careful, Nancy." "In what way is she a troublemaker?" Nancy asked. Bess said that Mrs. Dondo had come from Virginia. She left there because of some unpleasantness with her neighbors. At least, that's what Mother heard at a club meeting. "What was the matter with her?" George demanded. Bess said Mrs. Dondo was a social climber, a schemer, and a very unpopular person. "She isn't a bit like other people in this neighborhood," Bess went on. "I can't understand why she came here." Meanwhile, Togo had been crawling under the hedges and foundation plantings of nearby homes, sniffing for envelopes like the one his mistress had shown him. While waiting for the girls, Nancy had been looking in the trees and high bushes. Neither she nor the dog had had any luck. Bess and George eagerly joined the search, and for nearly a half hour the group combed the entire area thoroughly. Finally, Bess sighed. "If there were ever any letters around here, they're gone now. Maybe other neighbors found them." "That's very possible," Nancy agreed. She said that since all the families in the neighborhood were fine people, they would have delivered any mail they found to the addressees. "Then maybe Mrs. Dondo has her letter by now," George suggested. "Let's find out." "And if she doesn't," said Nancy, "I'll try talking her out of going to the postmaster. I'd hate to see Mr. Ritter get into trouble. He's been a wonderful friend to all of the people on his route." The three girls walked to the Dondo house. Before they had a chance to ring the bell, sounds of quarreling voices came from the open window. A man, whom the girls assumed to be Mr. Dondo, was reprimanding the woman. That was a pretty cheap trick of yours, trying to get easy money out of the mailman." The woman flared in reply. "What do you know about it?" "I know this much," the man replied. "That good-for-nothing brother of yours, Alonzo, would never send you $100. "Oh, be quiet," Mrs. Dondo screamed. "Alonzo is all right. You just don't like him." "You bet I don't like him, and for good reason, too. Alonzo's too slick for his own good. If he ever told you he was sending you $100, he sure was kidding you." When Mrs. Dondo would not admit that her husband was right, he said, "I don't like your brother's business dealings, but I don't think he's stupid. Alonzo wouldn't send that much cash through the mail." The three girls looked at one another and smiled. Nancy had never picked up such incriminating information just by accidental eavesdropping. She and her friends tiptoed away and hurried back with Togo to the Drews. "Mrs. Dondo may still try to make trouble for Mr. Ritter," said Bess as they went inside. "Let her try it," George said with disgust. "Nancy, Bess told me that you had 2 cases to solve. What's the other one?" Nancy smiled. "The 3 of us are going to hunt for a stained glass window." "What?" the cousins chorused. Quickly, Nancy explained about the article in the Continental and the reward offered to anyone finding the old window that pictured the knight with the peacock shield. George looked interested, then grinned. With a twinkle in her eye, she asked, "Nancy, what will you do with all that money? You may ruin your amateur standing as a detective." Nancy quickly explained that she would not take the money for herself. "I've been thinking I'd love to make a donation to the hospital fund, toward the new children's wing. If I win the reward money, it can be paid directly to the hospital." "That sounds wonderful," said Bess. "Will you help me?" Nancy asked the cousins. "Then we can make the donation together." George agreed at once, but Bess said one angle of the mystery worried her. She was seated in a large upholstered chair in the living room, near the doorway into the hall. Now she pulled her feet up under her and propped her chin on one fist. "I don't like this peacock business." "Don't tell me you're superstitious about peacocks," George teased. "You know better than that," Bess said. She turned to Nancy and asked, "Have you any theory as to what happened to the stained glass window?" "No," the young sleuth replied. "Of course, the window may have been destroyed long ago, but I'm hoping it hasn't been." "It could have been taken down and stored away," George said. "People sometimes get tired of looking at stained glass windows and remove them, just as they do pictures." "The place where the window was may have changed owners several times," Bess said. "They may have had a lot of hard luck and blamed it on those evil eyes in the peacock's fan." "Oh, Bess," said George, "you always—" The words were hardly spoken when a terrific bang startled Nancy and her friends. The next moment, a gust of wind blew into the room, carrying with it a large peacock feather, which came to rest at Bess's feet. The girl shrieked. End of chapter 2.